Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. Joining us now is Norman Soloman. Norman is a journalist, an author, a media critic, an anti-war activist, and former candidate for the United States House of Representatives from California. Norman, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, a pleasure. Hi, RJ.
Hi, good to finally, quote-unquote, meet you. Now, listen, you've been covering the Jeffrey Sterling trial a lot in recent months, and for many readers of the mainstream press, that this trial only came to their attention with its conclusion last week. And why is this trial so important? Why have you been covering it in such depth?
Well, this is a CIA leak trial that's virtually unprecedented in the history of the agency. In a public courtroom, day after day, hearing a procession of CIA officials, as well as Condoleezza Rice and others, try to essentially get this former CIA officer put in prison for a very long time. And he was charged and convicted with spilling classified beans about a ill-conceived, badly implemented CIA operation called Operation Merlin. So, long story short, there are profound implications for investigative journalism, for whistleblowing, and the public's right to know.
So we've heard, most people I think have heard something about the fact that whistleblowers tend to get prosecuted in this country, in the national security system, and they may have even heard that the Obama administration has been unprecedented in the level of its aggression toward whistleblowers in the national security system. But I first of all, I believe he's working with James Risen. Is that right?
Well, the allegation from the government is that Jeffrey Sterling was a source for James Risen's 2006 book, which included classified information about this CIA operation, which happened now 15 years ago. But that is in dispute. The jury ruled that he was a source for Risen, but frankly, after sitting through all of the testimony, it's unclear to me.
So I guess a couple questions come up for this, because I really do want listeners to understand the significance of that. There may be people out there who are saying, well, okay, James Risen, they went after him. The administration went after him for a long time. He was under threat of prosecution and so on. Ultimately, they decided not to pursue him. He's the reporter. But there will be people who say, well, you know, if you're a whistleblower for the CIA, you can expect rough treatment. What is a little different in your mind? What is off about that perception of the Sterling case?
Well, if people want to live in a society where the information they get is approved by the government, then by all means, let's prosecute and imprison whistleblowers. But a reality is that almost everything we know about, for instance, what's called the War on Terror, is because investigative journalists, often aided by whistleblowers, were able to tell us. So really what's at stake is whether we're going to have genuine democracy, which requires the informed consent of the governed, or whether we're going to have what is desired by people who run the CIA and, unfortunately, the White House and Justice Department now as well, which is to have the uninformed consent of the governed. You know, just as the saying goes with how you raise mushrooms, you keep them in the dark and you feed them a lot of manure. That's certainly one mode of governance, but what it has to do with democracy is a whole other question.
Well, we're talking with writer and activist Norman Soloman about the Jeffrey Sterling CIA whistleblower case. It gets me to another point that I think gets sometimes lost in the coverage of these stories. I would say you and I were around 30, 40 years ago when whistleblower, the word whistleblower, whether in the corporate or government context, was generally understood to be a descriptor for heroism. That a whistleblower was someone who, when they saw injustice being done, I mean, after all, this is not someone, and maybe we should talk a little bit more about what it was that was brought to light, allegedly by Jeffrey Sterling, but a whistleblower was someone who saw their government misbehaving, or not acting responsibly, or violating the tenets of democracy or the Constitution, and at great personal risk and with great personal courage did something about it. Dan Ellsberg or others. Now all of a sudden it seems as if the word itself, whistleblower, doesn't carry the overtones of courage it used to. Is that part of what's going on here, an attempt to demonize people who reveal these secrets and change the public perception of them?
Well, it's certainly going on from the White House and the executive branch, although, we could hark back 40 years ago where certainly Daniel Ellsberg was vilified by so many people in power as well. As a matter of fact, just yesterday I talked with Daniel Ellsberg about the conviction of Jeffrey Sterling, and he is appalled and aghast, and I think quite correctly sees it as very ominous for the future of any sort of flow of communication to the public about what the government is really doing. There's quite a lot of flow of public relations material and fluff and PR to the public from the government about ostensibly what the government is and is not doing, particularly in the so-called national security realm. And I think one of the huge overhangs on this entire topic, which is rarely talked about in mass media, is the reality of selective prosecution. The Senate Intelligence Committee issued a report just several weeks ago that included the information the CIA press office was routinely leaking absolutely top-secret classified information to their favorite journalists about the CIA's rendition and so-called enhanced interrogation technique program, i.e. torture, and they were doling it out to their favorite journalists, totally classified information, and wouldn't you know it, the CIA did not even file a crimes report when that material surfaced in the newspapers and in other media outlets, whereas when the leak went to James Risen about Operation Merlin, not making the CIA look good, but making it look bad, then all hell broke loose. There was a huge FBI investigation, and Jeffrey Sterling now is looking at decades in prison.
And a writer and activist, Norman Soloman, tell us a little bit about Project Merlin so that we can put this story in context. And we'll get back to this selective leaking and the administration's role, because I think it's very important. But for folks who are curious, what was Project Merlin?
Yes, well, Merlin was an operation that the CIA launched towards the end of the Clinton administration, and then it went into action in the year 2000, dropping off flawed nuclear weapon components design material to an Iranian mission office in Vienna, where the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is located. And the idea, which James Risen reports was ill-conceived, badly implemented, and frankly both dumb and dangerous, was to give a flawed diagram of a real nuclear weapons design, a Russian weapons design, to the Iranians on the theory that it would send them down the wrong path of nuclear development and screw up their program. But Risen documented, and Sterling went to a Senate Intelligence Committee through channels to express his concerns, that, in fact, the opposite was quite likely. The flaws were discernible, and rather than being a brake on nuclear proliferation, the CIA scheme actually was more likely to be an accelerator of it. The CIA doesn't cotton to criticism, and Sterling, by going through channels to the Senate Intelligence Committee in 2003, let's remember that was at the time of the U.S. invasion and initial occupation of Iraq, he raised really legitimate concerns, and the CIA, there's a lot of reason to believe, has retaliated.
So there are two important points you've raised here, Norman Soloman, and I want to give them both proper attention. Number one is that this was a badly designed and executed plan where, among other things, any competent nuclear engineer would know at a glance, according to what I've read, that these were not genuine plans or designs. And number two, or 1A, that it could actually have accelerated nuclear proliferation. And number two is the idea that, we have the current president, has said that people who should go through channels. That has been what we've heard about Edward Snowden, for example. Why didn't he go through channels? Now, we're talking about Jeffrey Sterling, a man who did go through channels in order to register his concerns appropriately, as he should do to the representatives of the American people. And there is reason to believe this is retaliation of a kind.
Yes, well, it's unclear just how glaring the flaws were, but there's a lot of indication the flaws were much more readily apparent than the CIA has claimed in terms of the diagrams for the nuclear component. It is an absolutely crucial point that going through channels, rather than being the fruitful and well-received process that President Obama and Eric Holder and others have claimed, is actually a lightning rod that flags troublemakers for harassment and sometimes prosecution, not only for Jeffrey Sterling, but also, for instance, for Tom Drake, who was a high official of the NSA, hauled into court, house-raided, facing decades in prison, offered a plea bargain, but he said, "I will not plea bargain with the truth," and got off with a slap on the wrist after the judge denounced the government for bringing really a faulty and nonsense set of charges into the court. And unfortunately, what happens in part is that these folks not only are harassed, but often overcharged. For instance, there ended up being 9 different counts, including 7 under the Espionage Act, that Jeffrey Sterling jury dealt with and convicted on all counts. Frankly, and I think this is a key point, this was in Northern Virginia, the home of the CIA, of the Pentagon, of the intelligence military-industrial complex contractors. That was the jury pool, and I saw the jury selection where that was quite powerfully evident. Attorneys told me if this trial had happened across the Potomac in Washington, D.C., the outcome might have been quite different.
So it happened in a company town, as it were, literally. And what I'd like to do is take a brief break, and when we come back, talk about the political context of this and the White House. We're talking with writer and activist Norman Soloman about the CIA trial, which just concluded last week. We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour with author and activist Norman Soloman talking about the trial of Jeffrey Sterling, the CIA trial, which has recently concluded. And I wanted to ask you, Norman, we have a president in the White House now who campaigned in 2008 telling us that he was going to stand up for whistleblowers and make life easier for them. Instead, we've had an unprecedented series of pursuit, Justice Department prosecutions and other investigations of whistleblowers. We have this case. What happened? Did we not get the guy we expected? We've heard the statistics that this White House has been more aggressive, taken more actions than all previous administrations combined in this area. What's going on with the national security state and the American people?
Well, it turns out that the Obama administration has become very hostile to some real pillars of civil liberties, particularly in the area that is called national security. And all of the claims from Obama that somehow he's going to protect whistleblowers, in effect, are null and void when it comes to all of these areas of surveillance, what gets called intelligence, military actions, whether it's the Pentagon, CIA, NSA, or these other 3-letter agencies. And the net result is that we have had a trend line pointing continually downward. And the Justice Department has been a tool to sort of fuel the momentum in that direction. I was an Obama delegate to the 2008 Democratic National Convention, and I was mistaken. I thought that it would make a difference to bring this guy in terms of civil liberties, and if anything, it's made a difference in a negative direction.
Well, in a sense, this is an unfair question because I'm asking you to speculate as I have speculated, and I was enthusiastic somewhat about Obama myself in 2008. What we know, going back to John F. Kennedy, that something's, I don't know whether what exactly happens, but Kennedy's fascination with espionage and even Ian Fleming novels, Bill Clinton's infatuation with national security infrastructure and activities. Now we have Barack Obama being unexpectedly and unprecedentedly aggressive towards whistleblowers, picking drone hit lists and all that. Is there a seduction, you think, that takes? Are they misleading the voters in their base, or is there? Do you guess, or is there some kind of seduction that takes place once they get in there and see the briefing books and have the power and all of that?
I think it's a combination with the paradigm that we can look to. In the case of Democrats, who are going to be more Catholic than the Pope, more militaristic than the Republicans, lest they be successfully baited. If you look at the opening of David Halberstam's classic book, The Best and the Brightest, JFK is about to become president. He's been elected. He sits down with one of the great foreign policy mavens of the last, most recent Democratic administration, the Truman administration. And that guy says, I think you should pick so-and-so. I think he recommended Dean Rusk, for Secretary of State and that sort of thing. And JFK took the nod from those elders of the party and the power structure, the military-industrial complex, so to speak. And I think that is very similar to what Obama has done. And he's really bonded with John Brennan, who now, of course, is the CIA director. And just to bring it back to the Sterling case, when Sterling was going to the Senate Intelligence Committee and spilling the beans about Operation Merlin, Brennan was a high official at the CIA. When Jeffrey Sterling, who was one of the few African-American case officers in the CIA, filed a racial bias suit and then took it into the courts early in the Bush administration, again, it was John Brennan who was responsible in part for turning down and blocking that racial bias suit from Jeffrey Sterling. So this goes back a long way, and then you look at the parallel war on investigative journalism where the same folks in power, including Brennan at the CIA, they hated James Risen, and frankly, it was clear from the testimony, muted though it was, they still hate James Risen because he's a real investigative journalist, and they want reporters to play patty cake with them and do PR for the Central Intelligence Agency.
And I don't think, and we're not going to have time to go into it in great detail, but I don't think the New York Times' record on this is all that heroic either, given that, as I understand it, they didn't even publish Risen's story until his book was getting ready to go to press, and I think they were afraid of being scooped on the reporting they had subsidized. Is that,
yes, it's a parallel story of media cowardice. In the case of Operation Merlin, the New York Times actually never published the information before it came out in the book. Meanwhile, Risen, along with Eric Lichtblau, had a story before the Bush re-election in 2004, several weeks before, and the New York Times refused to publish that story about illegal wiretapping in the United States, sat on it for 14 months. So there's a lot that the New York Times has to answer for as well.
Right, and the 14 months that they sat on that story, if I recall correctly, there was a presidential election during that 14 months.
Yes,
so the American
absolutely.
people...
The story was in hand by all accounts at least 2 to 3 weeks before the November election, Kerry versus President Bush. And later on, Bill Keller, then the executive editor of the New York Times, when challenged on this really disgraceful journalistic abdication and cave-in, he said, well, we didn't want it to seem that we were trying to influence the election, which is another way of saying we want to do journalism that doesn't have an impact against the powerful.
Or we want to protect the powerful from the impact of their own actions. I guess we could look at it that way, too. Yeah. So I'm thank you very much for your great coverage of and analysis of this story, Norman Soloman. And I also thank you for coming on the program. In the 30 seconds we have left, any closing thoughts for us?
Yes, it is an important and very complicated story. And I want to encourage listeners to look at our ongoing coverage of the Jeffrey Sterling CIA leak case, my colleague Marcy Wheeler and I at exposefacts.org. That's exposefacts.org, and they'll get a really detailed account of what the heck's going on with it.
Well, we know Marcy on this program. We've had her on, and now we've had you on. Thank you for the fine reporting. Thank you for coming on our program, Norman Soloman.
A pleasure. Thanks.
You bet. And we will be back right after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.